I had just set the axe head deep into the chopping block when the sound came. Not the wind, not the groan of timber under snow, but a slow dragging crunch that didn't belong to the woods. Out past the fence line, through the thick white curtain, a figure wavered into view. Barefoot dress ripped to the knees, hair dark and heavy down her back, she fought for every step. The snow clung to her legs like it meant to keep her there. She reached the last few yards to my porch before her knees buckled, falling forward into the drift. I hadn't yet decided whether to take a step toward her or turn back inside before whatever followed her found my door. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood in a moment where one decision could change the rest of your life. My name's John Merritt. I've worked the high country of northern Arizona long enough to know how winter can strip a man to the bone. Grew up on a dry patch east of Prescott, the third of 4 boys. My folks believed in keeping what you earned, sharing when you could, and giving thanks on Sundays, whether the table was full or bare. We built fence by hand, split rails from green pine, and drove cattle over miles of dust and stone. There wasn't money for frills, only for what kept us fed and warm. That's the kind of life that teaches you not to waste, not daylight, not firewood, not trust. After the war, I came back to nothing worth holding on to in town. I'd married young, thought I'd start a family on my own spread. But sickness doesn't ask permission. And it took my wife and boy before the second winter was out. The quiet that followed didn't sit easy in a place where folks kept stopping by to say sorry. So I bought a plot deep in the timber, where the nearest neighbor was miles off, and the only thing knocking at my door was the wind. Out here my days are measured in cords of wood, split stalls, cleaned fences mended. Nights are the crack of the fire, the weight of a rifle on the wall, and the sound of snow sliding off the roof. It's a plain life, but it's mine, and I've kept it that way. I've seen how the new money from the railroad changes folks' land, bought up by speculators, water rights tangled in court neighbors, selling their best pasture for a pocketful of silver. They call it progress, but I've watched too many good men lose their ground, too many families pushed toward the edge. Out here, I stay clear of all that. Keep to my own fence line deal only when I have to, and trust that the forest and the seasons will treat me fairer than men with paper and seals. That afternoon, the storm had been building since morning, thickening the air until the ridge was nothing but a shadow. I'd been at the woodpile for hours, trying to get ahead before nightfall. The cold bit deep, the kind that stiffens your gloves and makes your breath hang like smoke. That's when I heard those steps, unsteady, coming straight through the snow toward me. I set the axe down, narrowed my eyes, and waited. When she finally broke from the whiteness, there was no mistaking she didn't belong to this stretch of land, not in the way most folks mean it. Her dress was buckskin beading, torn loose and stiff with ice. Her skin was windburned, her feet raw against the snow. And when she fell, she didn't call out, just lifted her head enough for our eyes to meet. I took one step forward before stopping myself. Out here, folks don't wander in storms without a reason. And sometimes the reason's worse than the weather. I was still weighing that truth when the wind shifted and I caught the sound of another branch breaking somewhere back in the trees. The wind shifted just enough to send another flurry across the yard, and in that thin white haze, she tried to rise. Her arms braced against the snow legs, trembling, but her body sagged before she could find her feet. I stepped forward a pace, then stopped, my boots sinking deep into the drift. She was close enough now for me to see her lips moving, barely forming the word, "please." Her voice was hoarse, almost lost in the stillness. "Let me in." I looked past her to the tree line. The pines stood heavy with snow branches drooping, no sign of movement but the slow fall from the sky. She had nothing on her, no pack, no boots, no weapon in sight. The buckskin dress she wore was split at the seams, beads hanging loose, the fabric stiff with frost. Her hands were red and raw, her hair pulled into one thick braid that trailed over her shoulder. I'd seen plenty of hard cases out here, but none came barefoot through a storm like this unless they were running from something worse. I moved in slow, crouching beside her, so we were eye to eye. "Can you walk?" I asked. Her gaze flickered, then she closed her eyes for a moment and shook her head. I swept my eyes around us one more time, ridge to ridge, drift to drift, before sliding an arm under her knees and another behind her back. She was lighter than she should have been. Her body stiffened against me, but she didn't fight, just let her head rest against my shoulder. I carried her to the porch, pushed the door open with my boot, and stepped inside. The fire's heat met us at once. I set her down on the wool rug near the hearth, then pulled the thickest blanket from my cot. She leaned into the stonework, eyes half shut, breath shallow but steady. I wrapped the blanket around her legs, telling her to keep her feet off the floor or she'd lose them. No answer, only the smallest shift of her head in acknowledgement. I checked her fingers, chapped stiff but still pink. I poured hot water into a tin cup, added a pinch of salt and the last of the honey I'd kept from spring, and handed it to her. She gripped it with both hands, trembling, but drank slow. We didn't speak for a long while. She sat with her knees drawn up under the blanket, gaze fixed on the flames. I kept to my side of the room, moving between the stove and the table, feeding the fire every so often. When I finally asked her name, she answered without looking at me. Tala. I told her mine, and that was the end of it for now. It wasn't until the middle of the night, when the wind pressed hard against the shutters, that she spoke again. Her voice was quiet, almost carried away in the crackle of the fire. "I walked 2 days." I turned from the stove. With no boots, she gave a single sharp shake of her head. "Taken when they cast me out." I let the words settle before asking, "Who cast you out?" She lifted her chin slightly. "My people." There was no plea in her voice, no need for pity, just the flat truth of it. I nodded once. "You hungry?" This time she hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. I ladled beans into a bowl, tore a piece of bread, and set it before her. She ate slow, careful, leaving nothing on the spoon. The next morning, snow had drifted high against the cabin walls. I was outside early, shoveling a path to the barn and laying fresh straw for the cows. When I came back in, she was at the stove, braced against the table, trying to ladle her own meal. "You should have waited," I told her. She didn't turn. "I'm not helpless." I set my gloves aside. "Doesn't mean you're not hurt." Her eyes met mine, then guarded, but calm. "I can do small things." We ate together at the table, the silence between us less sharp than the night before. Midway through, I asked where she'd been headed. She set her spoon down. I wasn't. I frowned. "So, what then?" Her gaze stayed on her bowl. "I just walked." I leaned back slightly. "Into the snow with no food, no boots." She lifted her eyes to mine. I wasn't supposed to live. I didn't need to ask more. It was plain enough, left to the elements, expected to disappear before morning. She went on to say she'd been the wife of a chief chosen for ceremony, and when no child came, the blame fell on her. There was a firmness in her voice, the kind that comes from telling the truth after holding it in too long. I didn't push her with questions she wasn't offering answers to. That afternoon, she asked for a knife. For my hair, she explained, touching the frayed end of her braid. "It's tangled and dirty. I don't want to carry the past on my back." I handed her my small utility blade. She cut it clean to her shoulders, laid the braid by the hearth, and sat straighter afterward. The days that followed held the same steady rhythm. She moved more each day, her limp easing. She helped peel potatoes, carried kindling, and folded the bedding without being told. One cold evening, she spoke without looking up from the fire. "It wasn't me," she said. "I could have children." He was older than my father, but he couldn't let them think it was him. I sat down across from her, letting the weight of her words rest between us. She spoke of a boy she'd loved once, years before, and a child lost early. She didn't speak with shame, only the surety of someone setting the record straight. I didn't judge her for it. I'd seen worse done by better men. That night I pulled a wrapped bundle from the shelf and set it beside her. Inside was a pair of wool socks, a case, and a bar of clean soap. She looked at them for a long moment before meeting my eyes. "Thank you." It was the first time she'd said it. By the fourth morning, the blizzard winds had eased. The air was still sharp, but the cold had lost some of its bite. Tala moved through the cabin with more certainty now, her limp lighter, her eyes less dulled by exhaustion. I caught her once struggling to lift a bucket of water to the wash basin. "Let me do that," I said, taking it from her. "I want to," she answered, not looking away from the bucket. "Let me do something." We didn't speak more on it, but in that moment I understood she wasn't just trying to survive. She was taking back pieces of herself, one small act at a time. Outside, the sky was beginning to pale with the first break in the storm, and I had the feeling the hardest part of winter was not the weather, but what it had brought to my door. By the time the wind laid down to a steady whisper through the pines, the snow had set in crusts hard enough to hold a man's weight. The yard was buried deep, but the air had shifted. It no longer carried that biting urgency that drives you to keep moving. Tala was on her feet most of the day now, though she still favored her left leg. She moved quiet through the cabin gathering kindling, wiping the table or standing by the stove while water heated. That morning I was mending a broken strap on a feed sack when I heard the scrape of metal from across the room. She was wrestling the water bucket off the stove arm, straining. "It's too heavy," I said, crossing over. "Let me." She kept her eyes on the bucket. "I want to do something." I took it from her anyway, steadying it into the basin without spilling. She stepped back silent until the water settled, then spoke low. "It wasn't me." I looked at her. "Wasn't you what?" Her gaze stayed fixed on her hands. The reason he had no children, he was older than my father, but he wouldn't let them think it was him. I stayed still, letting her finish. "There was a boy years before. We were close in age. I lost that child early and no one knew." Her voice didn't waver. It was fact plain as the weather outside. "When the bleeding came back 2 moons ago," she went on, "I knew I was still able. But it didn't matter. I'd already been cast out." I reached to the shelf, pulled down a small bundle wrapped in oilskin, and set it in front of her. Inside was a bar of lye soap, a comb, and a thick pair of wool socks. She looked at them for a long moment before meeting my eyes. "Thank you," she said, slow like she meant it. That afternoon, while I was patching a hinge on the chicken coop, she washed her hair with melted snow water. By the time I came in, she'd braided it clean and tied it with a length of twine. She wore one of my flannel shirts over her dress sleeves, rolled him, cinched with a belt. Her steps were still guarded, but there was purpose in them now. That evening she stirred the stew while I cut bread. I asked, "You plan to go back when the thaw comes?" She kept her eyes on the pot. "There's nowhere to go." I thought she might say more, but she didn't. Instead, she asked how long I'd been here. 7 years, maybe 8. Came after the war, wanted land and quiet, got both. She asked if my wife liked it. She never saw it. I was building this place when she died. She didn't answer right away, just set the ladle down and sat across from me. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice even. We ate without more questions, talking only about the work ahead. What needed doing in the barn, what was left in the cellar. Before bed, she stood by the window watching the snow drift. I said, "Spring's a ways off yet. But if you stay through it, I'll help you build something. A shed or a room off the side. So you've got your own space." She studied my face for a moment. "You're offering me a place. I'm offering you the choice," I said. The days began to lengthen by minutes, the sun climbing just high enough to soften the edges of the drifts. Tala started waking before me, rekindling the stove, checking the water moving about with quiet hands. Her limp eased, and she took to straightening the bedding or slicing potatoes without being asked. She never acted like any of it was owed to her, but she handled each thing as if it mattered. One morning over breakfast, she asked if I still went to town. Once every few weeks when the trail's clear, I said. 15 miles if it's straight 20 if I have to go around the ridge. "People there know you?" she asked. "They know I keep to myself." She didn't ask to go, but I could tell she was thinking ahead past just getting through the winter. That day, I brought down a stack of old boards from the barn loft and laid them out by the cabin wall. She came onto the porch, arms folded against the cold. "You meant it," she said after a while. "About building something?" I nodded. I don't say things I don't mean. She stepped down and stood beside me. "Then, let me help." We started framing the new room that afternoon. Nothing fancy, just a space big enough for a cot and a table with a window facing the ridge. I showed her how to keep the boards flush, how to set the nails without splitting the grain. She learned quick even when the cold bit through her gloves. When she winced from her foot aching, she didn't sit down. She gritted her teeth and kept on. That evening, I poured her a cup of warm cider and told her, "You don't have to prove anything." She met my eyes across the firelight. "I'm not proving. I'm choosing." I understood that. I went to the cabinet and took out a bundle I hadn't touched in years, my wife's old coat. Wool-lined, patched at the shoulders, but still sound. I set it beside her. "It's just sitting otherwise," I said. She ran her hands over the cloth, then tried it on. It hung loose but warm. She nodded once. "Thank you." The next morning she wore it when we walked to check the traps at the tree line. It was the first time she'd left the yard since she arrived. The cold didn't seem to push her back anymore. She met it steady. On the way in, I asked, "You said there was a child before?" She looked down at the snow. "Yes." "Do you want one again?" She stopped thinking, then said, "I used to. Then I stopped believing, but now, I wonder if it was never me." She started walking again, adding, "If I ever had one, I'd want it born here. Not for someone's title, just for its own life." I didn't answer, but the words stayed with me. That night after supper, I said her name, just her name. She turned calm, and I nodded. She stepped close and kissed me, steady and certain. "I'm not leaving," she said. And I, who had lived years expecting everyone to go, told her, "Good." The snow had settled into hard ridges by the time the frame of the new room stood shoulder high. I'd set the last brace in place, and Tala was holding the board steady while I drove the nails in. Her cheeks were red from the cold strands of hair brushing against her jaw. She didn't flinch when the hammer struck, just shifted her weight to keep the plank flush. We worked until the light began to fade, and the air turned brittle. Inside, the fire was already throwing heat against the far wall. Tala set her coat on the chair and poured cider into 2 tin cups. I took mine and sat at the table, stretching my hands over the warmth. She stayed standing, looking toward the half-framed wall outside through the frosted glass. "It's starting to look real," she said. I nodded. "It'll hold when the wind comes up again." For the first time since she'd stepped onto my porch, her eyes lingered without that guarded watchfulness. She sat across from me, fingers curled around her cup. "I've been thinking about what you said about choice." Her voice was steady. "I haven't had much of that before. I let the silence between us be its own kind of answer." She went on, "I'm not here because I have nowhere else. I'm here because I want to be." A few days later, the traps along the ridge needed checking. She came with me, walking at an even pace. The snow was shallow in places, now crusted hard enough to carry our weight. At the far line, we found 2 rabbits and reset the springs. On the way back, she slowed and glanced toward the open basin. "I used to wonder what it would be like," she said quietly, "if I'd had a child where I'd wanted to grow." She met my eyes for only a moment. It wouldn't have been back there. That night after we'd eaten, I said her name. She turned, waiting. I told her I didn't ask for much, but when someone said they weren't leaving, I believed them. She crossed the room without hesitation and kissed me, firm, sure, without rush. "I'm not leaving," she said again. I answered the only way that made sense. Good. From then on, the space between us shifted. She still rose early to light the stove and fetch water. But now she moved closer when we talked, her hand brushing mine at the basin without either of us pulling back. I noticed the way she watched me when I worked, not with suspicion, but with a kind of measured trust. By the end of that week, the roof frame was ready for the first run of boards. She carried what she could from the stack by the barn, refusing to stand idle. I climbed the ladder, laying each plank into place, while she passed nails up in her open palm. The sound of the hammer echoed against the ridge, and the air smelled of fresh-cut pine. That evening, I brought down a bundle from the shelf, a small pouch of keepsakes from my mother. Inside was a silver ring, plain but solid, and a tiny carving of a pine tree. I set them in front of her. She told me to use these if I ever found someone who stayed. Tala's fingers rested on the carving for a moment before she looked at me. "I've already chosen," she said. I nodded. "So have I." After that, she began to sew in the evenings, small squares of cloth joined into a growing piece. She never said what it was for, but I knew. I kept working on the room, adding a second layer of boards against the wind. Neither of us spoke about the future in big words, but it was there in the things we built and mended. One morning, she was sitting at the table when I came in from the barn. Her hands were still folded in front of her. She looked up, took a slow breath, and said, "It's been weeks. I haven't bled." I stopped where I stood. "You're sure?" She nodded. "Yes." Her voice was calm, not looking for celebration, just the truth. "I feel different, stronger." I sat beside her, laid my hand over hers. "Then we planned for that together." She held my hand tighter. "If it grows, I want this child to live like we do. Not in fear, not under someone's name, just here with us." I told her that's what we'd do. No more words were needed. The next day, I cut fresh boards for the window frame, made certain the joints were tight, and she kept on with her stitching by the fire. A light snow began falling again that night, whispering against the roof. We sat together in the quiet, the fire steady between us, both knowing the thaw was still far off, but feeling something new take root all the same. By early March, the snow along the south slope had begun to break in patches, showing the first streaks of brown earth. The cold still settled in, heavy at night, but the days stretched longer and the light had a softer edge. Tala's pace had slowed in recent weeks. She worked as she always had, steady, deliberate. But I noticed how she paused more often, one hand resting on her middle, without thinking. The extra room was finished now, plain but solid, with a window looking east toward the ridge. I found her standing in there one morning, tracing the edge of the new shelf I'd fixed to the wall. She didn't turn when I stepped into the doorway. "I've never had a space that was mine alone," she said. I told her she did now. It wasn't a grand promise, just the truth. 2 days later, we walked the trail down to the fork where traders sometimes passed through. The snow was thin in the open, the air holding that smell of damp earth under meltwater. I carried a bundle of smoked meat, a pouch of coins, and a folded note she'd written by the fire the night before. It was for her mother. Nothing long, just that she lived, that she was safe and not alone. She left it in a hollow stump where it would be found. When we turned back toward the cabin, she didn't look behind her. That night, she was slicing onions for the stew when she stopped pressing her hand lightly against her ribs. I set my knife down and came to her side. "I've got you," I said, and she leaned back just enough for her weight to ease. "You always do," she murmured, before returning to her work. Later, after we'd eaten, and the dishes were washed, she spoke without meeting my eyes. "You never asked if I wanted to marry you." I told her I hadn't figured I needed to. We'd already chosen each other. She gave a small smile and said, "Still ask me." So I did. She didn't pause before answering. "I already am." When we lay down that night, her hand found mine and guided it to where our child turned slow and strong beneath her skin. "Our child," I said. She covered my hand with hers. "Our family." The wind outside had shifted no longer, pushing against the walls, just moving through the pines like a low breath. By the end of that week, the hens were scratching in the yard again, and the pasture at the west end showed thin green shoots. Tala moved carefully, but without hesitation, tending to her sewing while I worked the fence line. In the evenings, we sat by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes letting the quiet hold us. One afternoon, as the light thinned early, I saw her pause at the window, looking toward the trail. Her eyes stayed there a long time before she turned back to the fire. "When the thaw comes," she said, "I'd like to see if there's word back." I nodded. "We'll walk down together." She didn't speak again, but I could tell she was listening to more than the wind. The thaw came in slow pieces. Sap shone along the pine trunks. Icicles shrank on the eaves, and the creek began to speak again under the snowmelt. Down in the lower pasture, the ground was soft enough to show prints from the hens wandering farther from the yard. Inside the cabin smelled of fresh shavings from the new room. I'd set the hinges on the door only the day before, and the floor still carried the scent of cut pine. Tala stood in the doorway that morning, one hand resting on the frame. Her belly was showing now, not yet heavy, but enough that her steps had a careful rhythm. She walked slow around the space, touching the wall, the shelf, the window frame. "It's mine," she said simply. I told her it was, and she nodded like the words needed no more. We took the trail down to the fork again, the same place she'd left the note weeks earlier. The snow was thin here, broken by patches of earth and last year's grass. In the hollow stump where the bundle had been, there was a strip of woven cloth, a deep red, the kind used in her old lodge for ceremony. She picked it up with both hands, running her fingers along the weave. "She got it," she murmured. I asked if it was a good sign. "It means I am remembered," she said, her voice steady. That night she cooked the last of the winter carrots into a stew. Partway through, the child kicked hard, and she braced herself against the table until the movement passed. I came around behind her, steadying her at the waist until she leaned back a fraction. "You always do," she said softly before finishing the meal. After supper, she sat at the edge of the bed, the firelight catching on her hair. "You never asked if I wanted to marry you," she said. I told her I hadn't needed to. We'd already chosen each other. She smiled, small and certain. "Still ask me?" So I did. Her answer came without pause. "I already am." Later, lying in the quiet, she placed my hand over the curve of her stomach. "Our child," I said. She covered my hand with hers. "Our family." Outside, the wind moved through the pines without pressing against the cabin. It sounded less like winter now, more like the start of something else. By the week's end, the hens were laying regular again, and the west pasture was dotted with green shoots. Tala mended by the fire while I worked the fence and cleared debris from the melt. We ate early most nights, the light lasting long enough for her to stand on the porch and watch the ridge go dark. One evening, she stayed there longer than usual, eyes fixed on the trail. When we go down next, she said I'd like to see if there's more word back. I told her we would. She didn't speak again, but the way she stood told me she was listening to something beyond the quiet. The red cloth Tala had found at the trader's fork stayed folded on the shelf by her sewing basket. She hadn't spoken of it again, but I caught her fingertips brushing over it in passing like she was checking it was still there. The days were warmer now, the snow breaking into rivulets that ran toward the basin. My work moved outside, more mending pasture fence, clearing fallen limbs, setting new stakes for the garden rows. Tala came out when she could, sitting on the porch with her stitching, her feet propped on the rail. One afternoon, while I was tightening wire on the west fence, I saw her walking slow along the edge of the yard. She stopped now and then to rest her hand against her middle, watching a hawk circle above the ridge. By the time I came in, she was at the table folding a small pile of finished cloth squares. "Blanket's nearly done," she said, glancing toward the shelf where the carving from my mother rested. The next morning, we set out early for the fork. The ground was soft underfoot, and in the hollows the air still held the bite of shade. When we reached the stump, there was nothing new. No sign anyone had been through since the last. She stood there a moment longer than needed, then turned back toward home without a word. That evening, as I was bringing in firewood, I heard her call my name from inside. I stepped through the door to find her sitting by the hearth, her face pale but calm. "It's time we speak plain about the birth," she said. We talked about what needed to be ready: water-drawn blankets, close a cot in the new room. I asked if she wanted anyone from town. She shook her head. "Just you." The following days, we worked in quiet rhythm. I split wood for the warmer months and stacked it under the lean-to, while she organized the new room, setting aside space for the baby's things. I found her once, holding the little silver ring from my mother, her thumb tracing the band. She didn't notice me at first, then slid it back into the pouch and went on with her sewing. One night, the wind came up sharp again, rattling the shutters. She shifted in bed, wincing, then settled against me. "I want this child to come into stillness," she said, "not into noise or fear. I told her we'd see to it." Her breathing slowed after that, and she fell asleep with her hand over mine. It was near sundown a few days later when I saw a figure moving along the lower trail. Too far to make out, but the gait was deliberate, not hurried. I stayed on the porch, watching as the shape drew closer through the last light. Whoever it was would be here by dark. The figure on the lower trail reached the yard just as the sky gave way to night. It was Sheriff Clay Danner, his hat pulled low, a leather satchel in hand. His boots crunched over the frost-stiff grass, and he tipped his head in greeting. "Evening, John," he said quietly. "Thought I'd best deliver this myself." We stepped into the lamplight, and he set the satchel on the table. Inside was a folded court paper, the seal unbroken. Tala moved closer, her hand resting against the small of her back. Clay explained that the judge had signed the final order. Land rights settled, no claim left for those who had tried to take them. "This place is yours," he said, glancing at Tala. "Yours to pass on." Tala touched the edge of the paper, her eyes steady but bright. I thanked Clay, and he left, as he'd come fading into the dark, with only the sound of his horse's hooves carrying over the frost. That night the wind died down, and the air felt still as water in a deep well. We sat by the hearth, the court seal between us on the table, and for the first time in months my shoulders eased. Tala reached for my hand, guiding it to rest over hers. Beneath it I could feel the steady movement of new life, strong and sure. Morning broke pale and quiet. We stepped out onto the porch, the world around us silvered with a light frost. The mountains to the west caught the first gold of the sun, and the creek whispered over the rocks below. I thought about how much had changed since the first day I found Tala on the trail. How much we'd both fought to hold on to what was ours. The land had given us trials and taken its share, but it had also given us a place to stand side by side against whatever came. I knew there'd be more hard seasons, more fences to mend and storms to weather, but we'd meet them together. Life out here isn't about what you can take. It's about what you're willing to stand for and who you stand beside when the wind turns cold. I reckon that's the truest wealth a person can hold. If you've ever known that kind of bond, you know it's worth more than any paper or deed. And if you haven't yet, I hope you find it before the sun sets on your own trail.